The fog rolled across the Argonne Forest like a living tide, curling around gnarled oaks and weaving through the trenches left by countless soldiers before them. It was October 2nd, 1918, and the northeastern French wilderness had already begun to reclaim the scars of war. Within this gray silence, 554 men of the United States Army's 77th Infantry Division advanced, boots sinking into damp earth, rifles clutched as though mere grip could summon courage. They were the 1st Battalion, 308th Infantry Regiment men, drawn from New York's streets, factories, and offices now, transposed into a landscape where every shadow might conceal death. Major Charles White Whittlesey, a Wall Street lawyer turned officer, walked at their forefront, spectacles catching the pale light of a waning sun. To the men behind him, he was both guide and guardian, a figure of steadiness amid chaos. Yet the forest had its own designs. The fog swallowed sound and light alike, turning measured steps into a tentative dance, each man feeling the other's presence rather than seeing it. The distant crack of artillery ricocheted through the mist, a reminder that the world beyond the trees still raged, indifferent to the small cluster of men pressing forward. They moved like shadows, advancing into a void that offered neither landmarks nor reassurance. Trees became silhouettes, then vanished entirely, leaving only the disorienting hum of uncertainty. By nightfall, the battalion would find themselves isolated, encircled by German forces, the lines they relied upon rendered meaningless by fog, terrain, and the invisible hand of chance. By week's end, their names would be etched into history as heroes. Yet in these first hours, they were simply men carrying rifles through mist, unaware that the forest was both path and predator. Every step into the Argonne was a step into ambiguity. The crunch of boots against leaf-littered soil became a rhythm of tension, punctuated by whispers of wind that sounded like voices. The soldiers strained to make sense of movement just beyond sight, scanning for the telltale glint of an enemy rifle or the flash of artillery fire. Fear and determination entwined, each man moving as if propelled by something larger than himself: honor, duty, or perhaps mere instinct. Even the command structure could not shield them. Major Whittlesey's leadership, steady and meticulous, could not pierce the haze that obscured both vision and understanding. Orders became murmurs swallowed by fog, gestures meaningless in the gray expanse. The forest and mist acted as twin antagonists, bending time and space into a labyrinth that would trap them for days. And yet, amid the disorientation, a fragile thread of humanity persisted. The murmured encouragements, the shared cigarettes, the quiet prayers offered to whatever deity would listen. These moments, brief and fragile, would be remembered long after the fog lifted. For now, though, the battalion advanced deeper, vanishing into the Argonne, leaving behind only the questions that would haunt generations. How could 554 men disappear into mist and forest only to emerge 6 days later as half their number carrying wounds both seen and unseen, their story already becoming legend? Major Charles White Whittlesey did not enter a battlefield like a figure from legend. He did not wear the swagger of a lifelong soldier, nor the scars that whispered of past campaigns. Born in 1884 in Florence, Wisconsin, he had once walked the quiet halls of Williams College and Columbia Law School, carrying briefcases instead of rifles, arguing corporate cases instead of strategy. In the bustling offices of New York City, he had learned precision, logic, and restraint, qualities that seemed ill-suited to the chaos of war. Yet by 1917, when America joined the Great War, these same traits became weapons of another kind. At 33, wire-rimmed glasses perched over keen eyes, he embodied the ideal of the citizen soldier, a man of ordinary origins called to extraordinary circumstances. The 77th Infantry Division, the Metropolitan Division, was no conventional army unit. It was a mosaic of the city itself. Italian stonecutters who carved marble with their hands, Jewish tailors whose fingers stitched fate into cloth, Irish dockworkers hardened by the Hudson tides, Polish factorymen accustomed to relentless machinery. They spoke 26 languages between them, yet none spoke the tongue of uniformity that military life demanded. Into this chaos Whittlesey stepped, not with orders shouted from a platform, but with patience honed in courtrooms and offices, training them with methodical rigor. He earned their respect, not through charisma, but through competence, through fairness, through the quiet certainty that he would not ask of them what he would not first endure himself. War would test every fiber of his being. By autumn 1918, the men under his command had been bloodied in France, bruised by skirmishes that left the earth churned and scarred, yet their cohesion had strengthened under Whittlesey's measured guidance. The Meuse-Argonne offensive, launched on September 26th, was their trial by fire, the final great push to pierce the Hindenburg Line, a line of trenches, barbed wire, and sheer human determination. Every step forward demanded more than courage. It demanded trust. Trust in men who spoke different tongues. Trust in leaders who had never held a battlefield before. Trust in the fragile thread of discipline that could mean survival. Whittlesey carried not only maps and orders, but the weight of responsibility for 554 souls, each man a universe of hope, fear, and history. His civilian passo, orderly, so predictable, contrasted sharply with the daily unpredictability of artillery, mud, and blood. Yet perhaps it was precisely this contrast that forged his leadership. The clarity he had cultivated in courtrooms became clarity under fire. The meticulousness of law became strategy in the forested chaos. And the compassion that had been nurtured in city offices became a lifeline for men facing the unknowable. In the midst of northeastern France, where the forest swallowed light and sound alike, Whittlesey was both architect and anchor. He shaped the battalion's movements, anticipated the dangers of unseen terrain, and maintained the delicate bond between men who had never imagined themselves soldiers. By understanding their backgrounds, their fears, their strengths, he became more than a commander. He became the linchpin of survival, the unseen hand guiding them through fog and artillery toward a fate none could yet foresee. The bonds he forged, the discipline he instilled, and the humanity he preserved would soon be tested to the limits of endurance. As the Argonne Forest awaited, indifferent to citizenship, language, or past life, in Whittlesey, the battalion found their guide not a warrior sculpted by campaigns, but a man shaped by duty, intellect, and the quiet steel of resolve. The Argonne Forest was not merely a stretch of earth. It was a nightmare made flesh, a living labyrinth carved over 4 years of relentless war. Trees twisted toward the sky like skeletal fingers, their branches tangled in a permanent embrace, shadows pooling beneath them in uneven, deceptive darkness. Ravines choked with underbrush hid the detritus of past offensives, rusted helmets, fragments of uniforms, shattered rifles, and the ghostly hiss of unexploded ordnance, waiting to claim the careless. Every hill, every clearing, had been engineered by the Germans with meticulous cruty barbed wire, threaded like a web. Concrete pillboxes camouflaged beneath moss, interlocking fields of fire that made open ground synonymous with death. Into this charnel wood, the American High Command demanded motion. General John J. Pershing, a figure of rigid discipline and national ambition, insisted on aggression. Forward. Always forward. To assert the fledgling U.S. presence in the coalition and prove that American soldiers could strike with both courage and precision. Orders came to Whittlesey on the gray morning of October 2nd. Push forward at all costs. Seize positions along the Charlemagne Brook and Old Thames. The plan assumed coordination French units on one flank, fellow American battalions on the other. A seamless tapestry of support. That assumption would prove fatal, as companies A, B, C, E, G, and H of the 308th Infantry shuffled through mud and fog, alongside detachments of the 306th Machine Gun Battalion and 307th Infantry. The forest swallowed them. Fog clung to their shoulders and eyes, silencing the forest's usual chorus of wind and bird call, turning every sound footsteps, whispered commands, the faint click of rifle mechanisms into an ominous echo. Communication runners vanished into the gray, swallowed by the trees or struck down without warning. Visual contact with flanking units disappeared, dissolving the sense of cohesion that soldiers relied upon like a lifeline. Yet the battalion pressed on, threading carefully through the German positions, as if led by intuition itself. They moved in measured bursts, pausing at each ravine, each dip in the earth, scanning the mist for movement. Every captured position demanded vigilance. Every tree, every mound, could conceal an enemy rifle, poised to strike. By mid-afternoon, they had advanced nearly a kilometer beyond the main American lines. threading deeper into hostile territory with only the fog as companion. Then, against all odds, they captured their objective, a wooded ravine near Hill 198, a tactical prize card from the heart of enemy defenses. For a moment, triumph shimmered through the battalion. The men clutched their rifles, mud-slicked and bloodied, exchanging hurried, exhausted nods. Then the fog lifted, and the reality sank in. They were alone. No French reinforcements, no American flank support, no visible line to guide them back. The forest seemed suddenly alive, watching, waiting, indifferent to their courage. Here, in this liminal space between victory and annihilation, Whittlesey's men would confront the fragile boundary between order and chaos, life and death, known and unknowable. The Argonne had claimed their certainty, leaving them to navigate its labyrinth as both hunters and hunted. Be nightfall. The battalion would feel the first whisper of the legend that would follow them, the vanishing of 554 men into the fog. Their survival depended not just on training or bravery, but on resolve, intuition, and the tenuous bond forged between a man of law and the men he led into hell. October 3rd dawned with a harsh clarity that offered no comfort. Whittlesey's battalion, reduced to roughly 550 men after the losses of the advance, occupied a steep-sided ravine carved like an amphitheater into the hillside. Roughly 300 meters long and 60 meters wide, it offered a precarious sense of security, hemmed in on three sides by the higher ground above. From these heights, the forest and fog seemed almost tranquil, deceptively so, while the Germans moved with calculated precision, recognizing the opportunity the American advance had unwittingly provided. Elements of the Prussian 76th Reserve Division and the 2nd Landwehr Division began methodically encircling the pocket. Runners and carrier pigeons sent to request support never returned. The ravine, once a position of advantage, became a trap. Snipers claimed any man who dared expose himself, while machine gun fire cut across the slope with mechanical inevitability. The battalion had carried only what they could bear in the rush of their advance. A single day's rations, limited ammunition, and scant heavy weapons for machine guns to one-pounder cannons. Even water became a battlefield. A small spring of the ravine's base offered the only respite, yet it lay fully exposed beneath German rifle sights. Men attempting to fill canteens fell instantly, the splash of life extinguished before it could reach them. Whittlesey.com and Resolute became the axis of survival. He surveyed the perimeter, divided it into sectors, rationed ammunition, and established listening posts. Every detail, every movement, became a matter of discipline. To bolster command, he promoted Captain George McMurtry, a 42-year-old Harvard graduate, an experienced officer, to second in. McMurtry's presence offered both experience and reassurance, a stabilizing hand beside Whittlesey's methodical mind. Together, they guided the men through the strange rhythm of siege life, digging shallow foxholes in rocky soil with bayonets and helmets, fashioning lean-tos from branches, and waiting. Waiting became a discipline as exacting as any drill, a test of nerves, patience, and courage. October 4th arrived with violence. The Germans launched their first serious assault, descending the hillside in waves, grenades showering the ravine like lethal hail, Flammenwerfer teams sweeping fire across the perimeter. The Americans, disciplined and unflinching, fired with strict economy, every shot measured, every volley deliberate. The assault was repelled, but at a cost. Casualties mounted with each hour, the wounded piling into makeshift shelters and foxholes. Medical supplies dwindling to critical levels. The isolation weighed heavier than the artillery, the sense of being unseen and unheard pressing on every man. Yet in this crucible of fear, exhaustion, and deprivation, order endured. The battalion's cohesion, forged over months of training and tempered in the advance, held. Men shared what little they had, whispered encouragement across the fog, and watched over one another as the forest closed in, indifferent to their courage. Here, in the confined, rocky embrace of the ravine, the battalion learned the merciless lessons of siege warfare, that discipline must outlast fear, that every ration and every bullet carries the weight of life itself, and that survival often hinges not on strength alone, but on patience, ingenuity, and the quiet resolve of a few steadfast leaders guiding their men through the storm. By October 5th, the ravine had become something between earth and nightmare. A channel, between survival and death, shared the same fragile ground. Men huddled in shallow holes, groaning for water, for morphine, for any relief that might spare them from the creeping agony. Lieutenants Philip Sapaglia and William Cullen, the battalion's only medical officers, moved tirelessly from one wounded soldier to another, performing amputations with pocket knives sterilized over candle flames, binding wounds with strips torn from undershirts. The scent of gangrene and sweat, of pine sap and cordite, hung thick in the air, pressing on every lung, searing the memory of every inhalation. German artillery had found their range. High-explosive shells tore into the treetops, spraying shrapnel and splintered wood like rain. Men learned quickly which trees offered the least exposure, pressing themselves flat against roots and earth, hearts hammering as death struck indiscriminately. The forest no longer whispered, it shouted, with bark and iron and screams entwined. Night offered no reprieve. The Germans employed psychological warfare with cruel precision, calling to them in English names lifted from identity discs, stolen in previous engagements. "Come on over, Whittlesey." Voices taunted through the darkness. "Your men are dying for nothing." Food and water dangled as promises, offered as bait to surrender, yet the major never responded. Whittlesey became a moving anchor amid chaos. He traversed the ravine each night, whispering encouragement where voices trembled, inspecting positions, straightening rifles, checking foxholes. His calm became totemic. As long as he remained steady, his men endured. Hunger gnawed relentlessly. The battalion's single day of rations had long vanished. Soldiers chewed bark and leaves, scraping sustenance from earth itself. Some crawled under darkness, daring to recover supplies from fallen German positions, returning with what they could salvage or not returning at all. Ammunition dwindled toward emptiness. Whittlesey issued strict orders. Single-shot fire only. Conserve each round, each bullet a lifeline. By October 6th, desperation had crystallized into near communication with the outside world was all but severed. Then, a fragile thread of hope arrived in the form of a carrier pigeon. Its small body bore a message that seemed to balance on the edge of irony and salvation. "Situation is critical. Artillery fire is falling on our own position. For heaven's sake, stop it." The American guns fell silent, sparing the ravine from self-inflicted slaughter. Yet no relief followed. The battalion remained isolated, the fog of war as complete and unyielding as the forest fog surrounding them. Amid the relentless shelling, the cries of the wounded, the cold hunger and gnawing exhaustion, the battalion endured. Each day became a calculus of survival. Each night, a test of mental and physical endurance. Yet through it all, Whittlesey's presence, the quiet certainty, the disciplined calm, the whispered encouragement shaped them. They were not simply surviving. They were clinging to a fragile order imposed on chaos. A reminder that leadership, courage, and human connection could carve a path through even the most implacable hell. Here, in this narrow ravine under the indifferent skies of the Argonne, the true cost of duty and resilience was measured, each heartbeat a small victory against the encroaching darkness. October 7th dawned with a promise that turned to terror. After days of withstanding German fire, the battalion faced a new horror from a source they trusted most: their own artillery. High above the ravine, American guns sought to support them, but miscalculations transformed salvation into slaughter. At 10:47 a.m., the first salvo tore through the forest canopy, high explosive rounds crashing down among men who had survived 3 relentless days of enemy assault. The earth shook, trees splintered, and soldiers who had clung to life with grim determination were shredded by the very forces meant to protect them. Wounded men screamed, their cries mingling with the roar of falling shells, a symphony of chaos and pain. Whittlesey moved with desperate clarity. Amid smoke, mud, and blood, he scrawled a message on a scrap of paper. "We are along the road, parallel 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." It was entrusted to the battalion's last remaining carrier pigeon, Cher, a small blue and gray bird who had already flown through danger twice before. Private John Nell released her into the sky. German rifles spotted her immediately. A fusillade erupted, bullets slicing through the air, and Cher faltered, twisting, falling. But against all odds, she rose again, battered yet determined, climbing above the trees and heading south, toward American lines. The bombardment continued for 30 excruciating minutes, each second a nightmare measured in splintered wood and shattered bottles. Then, suddenly, it ceased. Cher had reached her destination, covering 25 miles in 25 minutes, despite grievous wounds. A bullet through the breast, one eye blinded, her right leg hanging by a tendon. Her survival would become legend, awarded the Croix de Guerre. Cher lived another year. Taxidermists preserved her body, now displayed at the Smithsonian, a testament to courage transcending species, a symbol that, even in the depths of despair, extraordinary acts could pierce the fog of war. The human cost was devastating. 30 men, nearly a tenth of the remaining force, were killed or wounded in moments that could not have felt more surreal. Morale wavered, and grief surfaced in stark, raw ways. Some soldiers wept openly, tears carving paths down mud-streaked faces. Others sat in hollow silence, eyes wide and empty, the mind unable to process betrayal by one's own guns. Yet amid the chaos, Whittlesey persisted. He moved through the positions again, his voice hoarse but unwavering. Hold fast. They know where we are now. Help is coming. Whether he believed it himself mattered little. What mattered was that his men did. In that ravine, surrounded by both enemy and the deadly miscalculations of their allies, the battalion confronted the cruel paradox of war. That salvation could arrive disguised as destruction, that even hope could carry a bullet. Yet in the flight of a small, wounded bird, in the steady presence of a resolute leader, they glimpsed the fragile thread that could still bind them to life. And so, through smoke, grief, and blood, the fight contended not just against the Germans, but against despair itself. October 8th dawned over a battalion teetering on the edge of disintegration. Of the original 554 men, only about 190 remained combat effective. Another 100 lay wounded, many delirious with fever, their moans echoing across the ravine. Ammunition was so scarce that riflemen clutched 5 rounds or fewer, counting each like a treasure. Machine gun crews scavenged corpses for cartridges, fingers numb and trembling. Water deprivation had begun to exact its psychological toll. Men licked dew from leaves, sucked moisture from moss, hallucinations creeping like shadows at the edges of consciousness. Yet through the ravines, suffocating despair, discipline endured. Whittlesey moved through the battered positions with a quiet, methodical presence, each step a lifeline to men whose courage was fraying. Captain George McMurtry, himself wounded but refusing evacuation, marshaled the final defensive line, shouting orders in clipped tones that carried over the groans of the sick and dying. Lieutenant Maurice Revnes and William Cullen led foraging parties under darkness, crawling into no man's land to retrieve equipment from the debris-strewn terrain. Every mission a gamble against death. Among them, Private Abraham Krotoshinsky, a 22-year-old Jewish immigrant from Poland, volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, slipping through German lines multiple times to scout positions, returning with vital intelligence that would later earn him the Distinguished Service Cross. The Germans, perceiving the battalion's dire state, intensified psychological pressure. That morning, a captured American soldier, Corporal Lowell Hollingshead, was forced to deliver an ultimatum. Surrender within 30 minutes, or face annihilation. Hollingshead whispered to Whittlesey that it was a bluff. The Germans lacked the strength for a major assault. Whittlesey's eyes swept over the remaining men, and he gave orders with the precision of a courtroom argument. Fix bayonets. Prepare for a countercharge. We are not surrendering, he told his officers. If they come, we counterattack. 30 minutes passed in agonizing silence. No assault came. Instead, sporadic firefights flared across the ravine, each one draining the few bullets they had left. That afternoon brought personal loss that even Whittlesey could not marshal against. Lieutenant Arthur Macchio, his adjutant, fell to a sniper's bullet, and the major, for the first time, allowed grief to show. Witnesses later described him weeping silently over the body, before straightening, resuming command as though composing himself from fragments of duty and resolve. In that moment, the human cost of leadership was laid bare. The burden of responsibility, the weight of decisions, and the isolation of knowing that every choice carried life or death consequences. As dusk fell on October 8th, the survivors shivering, thirsty, bleeding, and hollow-eyed prepared for what they believed might be their final night. Every foxhole, every scrap of cover, every remaining round of ammunition became a talisman against the coming darkness. In the silence between distant artillery and intermittent rifle fire, each man confronted his own exhaustion and fear. Yet amid despair, courage persisted, threaded together by the presence of a leader who bore both grief and determination, showing them that even at the breaking point, humanity, loyalty, and duty could still endure. October 9th, 1918, dawned gray and cold. In the Rabini, silence had become as oppressive as the forest itself. Men no longer spoke. They conserved energy, lying in shallow holes, their eyes hollow, their bodies rigid with exhaustion. Some whispered prayers into the mist, others scrawled final letters on scraps of paper tucked into pockets, messages from mothers, fathers, sisters, or wives. Each word a tether to a world beyond the forest. Whittlesey sat against a tree, eyes closed, gaunt, and motionless. The weight of 5 days of shell fire, hunger, and loss etched deep into his features. Then, at 7:15 a.m., the sound shifted. The distant rumble of artillery, once irregular and harassing, coalesced into rhythm and intent. High explosive rounds landed with precision on the German positions encircling the ravine. Trees shuddered under the force of explosions. Smoke and debris shot skyward as if the forest itself had awakened, and for the first time in 5 days, hope threaded through the battalion. 30 minutes later, voices rang out through the misted canopy. 77th. 77th. Where are you? Relief had arrived. Elements of the 307th and 308th Infantry, reinforced by the 82nd Division, clawing through the German lines after days of brutal fighting. The first relief soldiers stepped into the ravine and froze. What confronted them was beyond comprehension. Survivors resembled revenants, skeletal, filthy, eyes glazed and haunted. The wounded lay in rows, silent, their bodies mottled with mud, blood, and grime. The smell of decay and smoke mingled in the chill air, a testament to the ravine's relentless toll. Captain Eddie Grant, who witnessed it firsthand, later wrote, "I have seen the horrors of war, but nothing prepared me for that ravine. They were ghosts, dressed in uniform." Whittlesey, despite his own exhaustion, refused assistance. Eroslali, moving among the men, checking each wounded soldier, guiding, ensuring the most grievously hurt were evacuated first. Every step was a testament to the leadership that had sustained them through impossible days. Out of the 554 men who had entered the forest, 194 walked out under their own power. Another 150 were carried, wounded but alive. The rest 197 souls had been killed, captured, or remained missing in the chaos. The battalion emerged into history and legend. Newspapers christened them the Lost Battalion, a title both misleading and fitting. They were never lost, only isolated, surrounded, and rendered invisible to the world for 5 relentless days. Heroism shone in every scar, every bloodied uniform, every hollow-eyed gaze that returned to the light. Yet the cost of survival was stark, undeniable, and visible in every detail. The mud-streaked faces, the vacant stares, the bodies of the men who could not walk, the quiet weight of grief carried by those who had. In that moment, the Argonne Forest released its prisoners, but it left its mark indelibly on history and memory. Deliverance had come, but it arrived wrapped in the haunting clarity of survival's price. The men had endured, but the ravine had claimed its toll, etching heroism and horror into a single, unforgettable tableau. The Lost Battalion emerged from the Argonne on October 9th, 1918, but the reverberations of their ordeal would echo across lifetimes. Whittlesey was lauded as a national hero. He received the Medal of Honor, was promoted to lieutenant colonel. and paraded through New York City to ecstatic crowds that cheered his name, not knowing the full cost of survival. Newspapers lionized him. Politicians invoked his courage as a testament to American valor. Yet beneath the veneer of public adulation, a quieter, heavier reality took hold. The war concluded on November 11, 1918, with the Argonne offensive sealing an Allied victory. For Whittlesey, however, the applause and medals could not drown the memory of the decisions he had carried in the ravine. Men ordered to hold positions against impossible odds, runners sent into silence from which they never returned, bodies left among the mud and shrapnel. He fulfilled the obligations of a hero attending memorial services, delivering speeches about friends and comrades, noted his increasing detachment. The weight of command, of survival at such terrible cost, pressed inward, shaping a man who had once been defined by calm precision into a figure shadowed by grief. On November 26, 1921, barely 3 years after the battle, Whittlesey boarded the SS Toloa bound for Havana. On the first night of the voyage, he disappeared from the ship. No body was ever recovered. Most historians conclude he took his own life, overwhelmed by the survivor's burden and the commodification of his men's suffering, unable to reconcile the myth that the world celebrated with the reality he carried in silence. Other men of the battalion sought quieter forms of reconciliation. Captain George McMurtry, who had shared command in the ravine, devoted his life to advocating for veterans' rights and speaking against the glorification of war, turning experience into advocacy. Private Abraham Krotoshinsky returned to New York, resuming civilian life as a postal clerk, raising a family, rarely speaking of the Argonne, carrying memory in private rather than public. The battlefield itself bears witness. The Argonne Forest is now a memorial site, and the ravine where the battalion held remains largely untouched. Quiet hollow where silence speaks louder than celebration. Cherami, the small blue angray pigeon who had delivered Whittlesey's desperate plea through enemy fire, is preserved in the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, a fragile monument to courage and loyalty amid chaos. The story of the Lost Battalion became mythic, a symbol of American resilience, the immigrant contribution to the war effort, and the horror of industrialized warfare. Yet myth often obscures reality. The deaths of 197 men were not the product of grand heroism alone. They were shaped by command failures, miscommunications, and a literal fog that swallowed lives. Survival carried a cost beyond medals, and headlines a cost written in grief, silence, and the quiet, enduring weight borne by those who lived. Here, the battalion's legacy confronts us with the duality of war. The heroism celebrated, and the human suffering concealed, intertwined in a story that is as cautionary as it is inspiring, reminding us that history honors both courage and the unbearable burden it leaves in its wake. What really happened to the Lost Platoon, or, more accurately, the Lost Battalion in the fog? The answer is deceptively simple, yet profoundly human. They were caught at the intersection of military ambition and logistical reality, victims of doctrine that demanded relentless advance without sufficient reconnaissance, of communication technologies that failed when they were needed most. The fog that swallowed them on October 2nd, 1918, was literal. A gray veil across the Argonne Forest that erased visibility and distorted perception. But it was also metaphorical. The fog of war that Clausewitz described, where uncertainty, friction, and incomplete information transform even the most meticulous plans into chaos. The 77th Division's push into the Argonne exemplified late war American strategy, attrition through determined assault, willing to bear horrific casualties to force a German collapse. Whittlesey and his men paid dearly for that strategy. Yet their story endures not because of strategy or doctrine, but because of the men themselves, immigrants and working class. Americans from every corner of Ellis Island, 26 languages among them, found unity in the crucible of that ravine. When surrounded, cut off, and forgotten, they held. They fought not for empire, not for ideology, but for each other and the duty they had accepted. In that narrow, bloodied hollow, ethnic divisions dissolved. Survival demanded cohesion, and cohesion demanded courage. Modern militaries still wrestle with these lessons. The deadly gap between command intent and ground reality. The catastrophic consequences of communication failures, the human toll of operational tempo. The fog, both literal and figurative, still isolates units, still kills, still turns rational plans into desperate improvisation. And yet, the story of the Lost Battalion demonstrates something equally vital. Leadership, discipline, and collective will can endure even the most extreme circumstances. Whittlesey's tragedy was that survival felt like failure. He carried the burden of command, the deaths of those who did not return, and the unrelenting memory of the forest. But nearly 200 lives were saved by his steadfast presence, his careful organization, and his refusal to surrender. The psychological fog that followed him after the war, the grief, the survivor's guilt, the public accolades that felt hollow as real, and as lethal as the shellfire and mist of the Argonne. And this is why we remember the Lost Battalion. Not to glorify war, but to honor the individuals ensnared in its machinery, to see beyond the statistics and casualty reports, to recognize the human lives behind every uniform. The lawyer from Wisconsin, the Polish immigrant crawling through no man's, the Harvard-educated captain, and Cher, the tiny blue and gray bird who flew when all hope seemed lost. Their story is a reminder that courage, unity, and perseverance are not abstract virtues. They are human acts performed under unimaginable pressure, and it is a story that deserves to be remembered, discussed, and passed on. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to explore more untold chapters of military history where human courage confronted impossible odds. What do you think drove Whittlesey to the sea that November night? Share your thoughts below, and let's keep these memories alive for those who can no longer speak.